Happy Monday, and welcome to another episode of Cases That Should Have Gone to the Supreme Court of Canada, but didn't. Today, we're talking about Aboriginal law and recusal applications. Cases that should have gone to the Supreme Court of Canada, but didn't. Britany Beaver was involved in family law disputes before a certain judge. She ultimately filed a recusal application about that judge to try and argue that he should be recused from hearing her case. She specifically argued in her case that there were issues related to her Indigenous heritage, the issues that Indigenous people in Canada have faced as far as systemic discrimination and the horrific acts that have been perpetuated against Indigenous people both in our justice system and outside of it. And this was part of the foundation for her recusal application. Unfortunately, Ms. Beaver's recusal application was scheduled to be heard by the judge whom she was attempting to recuse. And this raises a very difficult question. How can a judge really impartially decide whether or not they're impartial? It's a strange issue that arises rarely, but sometimes in our legal system, where if a person is making an allegation of bias, whether it's a systemic bias against Indigenous peoples, as in this case, or whether it's a specific bias for specific reasons, generally speaking, the judge who is the one to determine whether or not there's a bias is the judge who is alleged to have held the bias. And that, of course, has the obvious complication of the lack of independence in making a decision about yourself. And while there have been many instances in which judges have determined that they are, in fact, biased against a certain individual or on a certain issue and recuse themselves appropriately, or that there might be the appearance of bias as a result of certain things, it doesn't really sit well that the judge who hears it is also the judge who's the subject of the application. And that in and of itself tends to raise the appearance of a bias just in the application. And this was Ms. Beaver's point in court. Unfortunately, her matter was going ahead in front of that judge against her will, and the courts didn't intervene to make things right for her. This was an opportunity for the Supreme Court of Canada to address something that, while rarely arising, is of significant importance to our legal system as a whole. If there's not a way for people to bring recusal applications in front of an independent judge to determine whether there's an issue of bias, then they have these fears that a bias will not properly be addressed or a potential appearance of a bias will not properly be addressed. And that's not something that we can have in a judicial system that is supposed to have impartiality as one of its core features. It's unfortunate that this application had to take place in this context as well, because we know that systemic discrimination is often subconscious in a lot of individuals, and asking somebody to consciously assess whether or not they have a subconscious bias as a result of systemic issues is sometimes something that a person isn't even capable of discerning about themselves. And so that complicates the issue further and makes it one that more frequently calls out for somebody else to determine the issue. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court of Canada missed the opportunity to set things a little bit more right for the position that Indigenous people are in our justice system, and the position that Ms. Beaver was in this particular case. It's going to take another case, another recusal application, and the fear that there's another person committing acts of bias or appearing to be biased against a specific racial group before we actually get some direction from the Supreme Court of Canada on this issue. And that's a frightening thing for our justice system. Cases that should have gone to the Supreme Court of Canada, but didn't. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Cases that should have gone to the Supreme Court of Canada, but didn't. I'm Kyla Lee at Acumen Law Corporation. Please like, subscribe, and share with your friends.